Okay. Yeah, thanks very much to the conveners for giving me the opportunity to speak about intermediate water masses in the North Pacific. So let me acknowledge my co-authors. These are people from our own Institute of Marine Geology and the Alfred Wegener Institute. It's a collaboration also with the Paleoclimate Modeling Group at the RV from Lohmann and Gong, and also collaborators from the GEOMAR, the gentleman to my extreme right here on the podium. I'm going to talk about ventilation, and I'm restricting myself to the last 12,000 years or so. Holocene, I encourage you, if you're interested in longer timescales, to go to a poster set up by Lars Max in this session downstairs, which is covering NPIW changes over the last 60,000 years. So why North Pacific intermediate water? It's one of the less well-studied water masses, intermediate water masses. Well, in principle, it's the water mass which is ventilating the upper or intermediate water ocean in the north. So on the core density surfaces, sigma theta 26.8, you see the maximum in dissolved oxygen here coming out of the Okhotsk Sea, northern Bering Sea, and impinging on the North American margin, going down to about 20 degrees north. I should also point out that it carries, or it's in terms of the vertical water masses, the uppermost water mass, which is carrying a significant amount of nutrients, silicate, for example, and which is carrying this to the lower latitudes. And these oxygenation changes in the subarctic North Pacific are basically reflected today in the modern water column in the delta C13 DIC. What you can see here, we measured some of the water samples from the outflow region in the Okhotsk Sea, inflow region in the Okhotsk Sea, and this positive anomaly here in the blue curve versus the red and green curves from the western subarctic Pacific water is the modern difference in the ventilation of the subarctic North Pacific. So arguably, this is the southernmost sea ice extent in the northern hemisphere. The water mass is built in wintertime through brine rejection, through sea ice buildup. So this is arguably a region which is very sensitive to global climate change, to environmental changes also on short and longer timescales. So do we have evidence for systematic environmental changes over the past years? And yes, there is. So one of the first studies who argued that we see decreases in the oxygenation in the modern water masses and increases in temperature in the western subarctic Pacific a couple of years ago pointed out that both in the Oyashio, the western subarctic Pacific water, and the lower regions, we've seen this over the past 50 years. And there is also evidence, if we go back 50, 60 years on instrumental timescales, without going into too much detail, but basically red and yellow colors here show a decrease in the oxygen concentration from 22 to 50 degrees north over the past 50 years. However, that being said, there are large interdecadal changes in that region. So basically one of the major questions we also have is how to assess regime shifts, natural background variability, versus possible anthropogenic overprints. So that's where we come in from the proxy data side. So did the Okhotsk Sea intermediate water ventilation change during recent past and warmer present times, and what are the effects of changes in this ventilation on North Pacific oceanography and potentially also on the nutrient utilization? So I'm going to show you a couple of cores I've been working on together with my colleagues over the past years. Basically, I'm showing you delta C13, epibenthic delta C13 data. I'm not showing you the data here, just have to believe me that this species, Cibicidis mundulus, is reliably recording the delta C13 of water masses. We did a number of studies on live rose bengal-stained benthics in comparison to the DIC of the, or delta C13 DIC of the water masses. We see no phytodetritus effects or other things. And I'm showing you here one core from the inflow region. So this core is recording the inflowing western subarctic Pacific water masses. This is this core here from 600 meters water depth. And three cores directly downstream of the formation region of the modern Okhotsk Sea intermediate water. This are these three cores over here. And arguably the temporal resolution of these cores is not too good. But what you can evidently see is that there is not much change going on in the inflow region. So we have more or less some variations around 0.1, 0.1.5, but there is no large trend. What you can also see is that in the earlier part of the Holocene, you see decreases relative to modern conditions in the delta C13. You see Mid-Holocene increase and probably a second step towards the late Holocene. So to get a better idea of the overall Millennial-Scale variability, what we simply did was stacking these outflow or Okhotsk Sea intermediate water ventilation records together. And that's what you see up here in the upper panel. So basically the gray part are the original data. See a smooth record in blue of the outflow here. And what you see in red in the background is basically the Western Subarctic Pacific water inflowing into the Okhotsk before the modern ventilation process happens. And some things I just want to point out here is, first of all, the modern prevailing ventilation pattern is a relatively recent one, it seems. So only over the past 2,000 years we've been observing in the Holocene ventilation conditions comparable to the modern conditions. If you step back further in time through the late to mid-Holocene, you see already a slight decrease in the average ventilation of the water masses coming out of the Okhotsk Sea. And most obviously, if you go into the earlier, so the warmer, the modern early Holocene, you not only see a decrease in the ventilation, but actually the delta C13 values of the outflowing water, which are then forming North Pacific intermediate water, are depleted in delta 13C relative to the subarctic Western Pacific water masses. One thing I'd like to point out here, evidently from this you can see millennial-scale variability. So if you do time series analysis on this, and I just put the filter output here, but what you can see is also a shift in the main millennial-scale patterns from a more or less 1,500-year cyclicity towards the late Holocene, more or less 2,500, 2,600-year cycles, or at least variations, and we ascribe this to a change in the low versus high latitude forcing mechanisms. So the major forcing mechanisms shift from the lower latitude oceanic 1,500-year cycle towards the later Holocene pattern, which we know, for example, from variations in the Siberian High, which is driving the wintertime sea ice conditions in this part of the world. If we want to know what actually is behind the delta C13 values in a sense, so what we can do is doing an approximation. I wouldn't call it an estimate, but what I did was actually plotting the water data for the delta C13 DIC values we and others measured in the Okhotsk Sea and in the North Pacific versus the dissolved oxygen concentration. And you can see that there is a quite good relationship between those two. So we could use as a first guess or as a first order approximation the delta C13 and try to calculate average dissolved oxygen concentrations of the intermediate water masses. And what you come up with basically is similar than modern conditions here. If we just bin all the data from these various intervals, so from the late Holocene, the late mid-Holocene, and the early Holocene, and just try to average this to an idea of the past O2 values, we see that this is about the modern oxygen concentration in Okhotsk Sea intermediate water. So we nicely more or less fit into that pattern, so that gives us some confidence in the reliability. And what you can see that is in the early Holocene we lose about 20 to 50% of the original oxygen concentration in North Pacific intermediate water already at the source region of the water ventilation. So to put this a little bit into the context of other records, up here again is the ventilation record I showed you earlier. And as I said, we think that the actual formation mechanisms are tightly linked to intensity of low latitude forcing. So this is an index of the intensity of the weakening. Upwards is the weakening of the East Asian summer monsoon. You can see that this is more or less fitting also on the millennial timescales, the pattern, the minima and maxima of our record. You can also see that this might be, in a sense, linked the longer-term trends to North Atlantic circulation changes. So this is the Thornley et al. Record, sort of a silt size record, where you see the changes in the Iceland-Scotland overflow water. We see concurrent changes in the ventilation of the North Pacific intermediate water. And just to point out that again, that this is the SST record of Japan, which was published a couple of years ago. It's an Elkanone SST record, and you see that in the early Holocene in that region we have about 2 to 2.5 degree warmer conditions in the SSTs than today, and that brings us basically the decrease in the ventilation of the intermediate water masses. Lastly, I should point out that this is also in accordance with delta 15N data, with nutrient utilization data from the Santa Barbara Basin and from the North American margin, showing elevated delta 15N values when we have decreased oxygenation values in the subarctic North Pacific. So to see how this fits into the broader pattern, we compared our proxy data to output from a model, so to time slice reconstructions from a model. This is we use the Cosmos MPI fully coupled Earth system model for that from pre-industrial and 9Ka time slice for comparison. So you can see that in the pre-industrial, the low salinity value of the NPIW is relatively nicely recorded in the overall pattern. Whereas if we step back into the early Holocene part, we see that we lose basically the entire low salinity signature of the NPIW on a north-south transect between the equator and 60 degrees north. So we have a higher salinity value and a higher temperature value throughout the entire North Pacific. So this is a cross-section at, I think, 150 degrees east. So what you can see, that's the difference plot. That's the 9Ka minus the pre-industrial value experiment. You can see both the warming. This is exactly here. This is going into the Okhotsk, the warming in the upper water masses on the dense shelf water in the Okhotsk Sea. And you also see the increase in salinity, which is then transported down southward. And we can see that this is basically then providing little to no oxygen anymore to the lower latitudes. Lastly, so what's the bearing of the basically of the ventilation record? And I'm just showing this as a kind of initiating some food for thought. So I just cut these two records in half. So this is again the ventilation record, and we saw that we have a systematic shift between the early and late Holocene regime. So if we go to the late Holocene, that's our ventilation record. That's the nitrous oxide record from the ice core, from the Antarctic ice core. And basically, if we step into the late Holocene, we see that the increase is so high, oxygen concentrations matches low nitrous oxide concentrations in the atmosphere. This is basically along the line of the argument that the oxygen concentration of the high subarctic latitudes precondition or steer to some extent the nutrient utilization, so suppressing the denitrification in the lower latitudes, and thus influence the greenhouse gas concentration, in this case nitrous oxide. However, if we step back into let's put it as a no analog or non-comparable situation where we lose the ventilation signal, we see that this correlation is shifting. So whereas we have the expected anti-correlation in the late Holocene part, we see that now the high or relatively high values are now matching more or less the peak patterns here in the nitrous oxide record. And with that, I think the yellow light is on, and I will go to the conclusions. And without reading through all of that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Lester. We have time for a couple questions.
So in the data you see reduced ventilation of intermediate waters in the North Pacific in the early Holocene, right?
Right.
And in the model there's a salinification that I didn't understand how that fits together. I would assume if the North Pacific gets more saline, that you have more ventilation of intermediate waters.
Well, actually, the North Pacific intermediate water today is defined by the salinity minimum. So what we see is a negative anomaly in the intermediate water. That's basically most of the intermediate waters have this relative negative anomaly of salinity. So what we seem to lose is the intermediate. Either we lose completely the intermediate water mass there in terms of the water mass stratification in the mid to deep layer, or we have another water mass which is coming out of the subarctic North Pacific and then impinging with a different nutrient content, with a different oceanographic characteristic on the lower latitudes. So basically what we also see, I didn't show you also the delta 18O values, but what you see is lower salinity water masses. So basically the indication is that you have low salinities and high oxygen concentrations in the source region.